started with living hope. Do you think the world might need a bit of hope right now? I think they need a bit of hope right now. I think we need some hope right now. We celebrated the life of Stan Rochford this week on Thursday with a celebration of life service. And what was marked was a continuous testimony of everybody who had a memory or of something about his life. And there were probably three links that went through all of the different memories and accounts. He loved his family. He told a lot of jokes. Funny or not. I have to fit an extra one in, actually. People in the family found missing items of clothing. I thought this was hilarious. They'd get to pick something out of the wardrobe and the sleeves of a cardigan would be cut off because he needed them to make a puppet. That was brilliant. Brilliant. Or they had odd socks because one of them was someone else. But the main thing that came across was that he loved Jesus more than anything else, and he loved to talk about Jesus. He loved to tell people about Jesus. There was a real sense of he lit up, was one way that it was said. He lit up when he started to speak about Jesus. I would love that to be said about me. It's a life well lived, and we are really grateful to be able to celebrate that. So, in the memory of Stan, I'm going to start with a joke. Well, that is for you to decide. Is it funny or not? Here we go. There's even a link to the sermon. This is how, Right, are you ready? Abraham bought himself a fancy new computer. He was showing it to Isaac one day. Look at all the wonderful programs it has on it, and look at all the neat things it can do. Isaac was impressed, but a little concerned. But Dad, I don't think your computer has got enough memory. And Abraham said, don't worry, son, the Lord will provide the RAM. Ta-da! Right, moving on. We're going to start a new series this morning, as you've heard. We've called it Living Hope. There are lots of things that help us to live well, but the one thing we really need in order to live is hope. Hope keeps people alive, but in this world, hope is often lacking. Now, I won't say this Russian name right. Fyodor Dostoevsky famously said, to live without hope is to cease to live. If we spend too much time looking around us, especially this week and the last few weeks, and we spend too much time listening to the media, rather than balancing that and outshining that with looking at Jesus and at the hope of who Jesus is and all that he's done, hopelessness won't feel too far away if that's where we get consumed. This world is in a mess. There was a line in that song, wasn't there? What was the line? The hope of nations. And I sang that this morning, the hope of nations. That's who Jesus is. He's the hope of nations. There isn't anyone else who's the hope of nations. Our aim with this series is to show us that as Jesus followers, we should be the people with the most hope possible. If I ask you to find scriptures on the theme of resurrection hope, I imagine you'll probably come up with the Jesus resurrection. That's an obvious one. Maybe when Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead. Maybe 1 Peter 1:3, which says Jesus has given us new birth into a living hope through his resurrection. But what we're planning to do with this series is we're going to journey through the whole of the Bible. Obviously, it's a whistle-stop tour because we've only got 6 sessions. We're going to journey through to show resurrection, living hope on all the pages. Well, we're not going to get all the pages, but we're going to show that kind of theme. Resurrection hope has been a theme throughout history, well before Jesus came to earth, and it will continue to be a theme for time to come. There's going to be a great resurrection. You may recall Laura encouraged us the other week to, at some point in your life, try and read the Bible kind of in order, kind of to get the whole story of what God has been doing from start to when we get towards the end. Let's see that whole picture. And so we're going to try and help us to do that with this series. We're going to kind of journey us through the Bible from the beginning, just to see resurrection hope throughout. I think we're going to see a continuous theme building throughout the whole Bible. And I'm starting on the first bit today, which is on the first 5 books of the Bible, the law or the Torah. And we're going to move through each week. And actually it builds as we go. And then when I was preparing this morning, I'm thinking, this is great already. This is really good. So just hold on to your hats. This is going to be great. And the idea is by the time we get to Easter Sunday, we're going to be absolutely ready to celebrate the resurrection hope that we've got. How does that sound? Where do we start? For humanity, everything began at creation. That's where it started for humanity. In Genesis, in the beginning, we discover what living the way God intended and created us to live looked like, in communion with God. But sin and ultimately death changed all of that. In the beginning, death was not part of life as we know it now. Death is a disruptor of life as it was designed to be. It came in the fall. But praise God, that's not the end of the story. Since Adam and Eve's exit from Eden, God has been delivering people from the power of death through resurrection. Our only hope is Jesus because he's the one and only one who has broken the power of sin and death. He lives as a foretaste of resurrection life that will be fully ours. But before we jump to Jesus' resurrection, on which all our hope is founded, we've got to wait a few weeks for that. Let's take a look at some resurrection sightings in the first 5 books. Sorry, I'm a bit thirsty. The law, the Torah, whatever you want to call it. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy are the books of the law. When we think of death, we think about breath stopping, heart stopping beating, kind of the end of physical life as we know it. But when the Bible talks about death, it means a lot more than just that. Whatever inhibits, harms, or destroys life is considered a kind of death. And therefore, whenever we read about God's power restoring, healing, bringing freedom, raising back to life, we're reading about the power of life overcoming the forces of death. So the enemy came to rob, kill, and destroy, but Jesus came that we might have life. And it's from before Jesus came, and Jesus was already there in the beginning, speaking creation into being, but death tried to disrupt, but resurrection life has been returned and restored all the way throughout history. When Adam and Eve sinned, they didn't immediately die physically, but their immediate separation from God's presence and provision in Eden was a move away from the source of life. They didn't have access to the tree of life anymore. You can read that in Genesis. So their exile from Eden was a kind of death. Do you get that? But when we see the opposite action taking place, when someone moves from the realm of death in all of its variations into God's supernatural restoration, we see the power of life at work. Genesis 5, it goes through Adam's family line. And so we see these genealogies. There's a genealogy in Genesis 5, there's some in Chronicles, there's some further on in Genesis, there's some Matthew and Luke. You see these patterns of so-and-so lived. They had these children, they lived this long, and then they died. That's basically the Genesis 5 story. And the way the chapter's written gives a rhythm to life and death as the order of things. If you've got a Bible, you get a quick glimpse of how it's laid out. It's kind of, Adam was born, Adam lived for so many years, Adam had a child, Adam lived a bit longer for the total of this number of years, and then he died. And then it moves on to the next one and the next one. But when we get to verse 24 of Genesis 5, which is the 6th generation after Adam, there's a wonderful interruption to the rhythm that jumps out. We're going to read it. When Enoch had lived 65 years, he became the father of Methuselah. After he became the father of Methuselah, Enoch walked faithfully with God 300 years and had other sons and daughters. So you've still got the same picture. Altogether, Enoch lived a total of 365 years. Enoch walked faithfully with God. Then he was no more because God took him away. That's a different ending to his story. The next verse then continues in the previous pattern about Methuselah. Methuselah lived, he had a child, he lived for so many years, and then he died, and it carries on. But there's this interruption in this rhythm here with Enoch, and I love the way that trying to get our heads around this occurrence stretches our minds. And this is absolutely amazing. It makes you stop. When you've got a constant rhythm going, you have one break, and then you have a constant rhythm going after it, you've got to go, hang on, there must be something in that. Death is the disruptor, but God is above the power of death. Taking Enoch was God delivering Enoch from death. He didn't actually see physical death. God just took him. Found tucked in chapter 5, a list of generations, one by one lived, had offspring, and died. God's interruption to the natural order since the fall in taking Enoch, so he didn't see death, is a ray of hope against the backdrop of expected death. It stands out. It is important. Why is it important? Well, if God could deliver someone before their death, then we have to ask the question, can God deliver someone after their death? What this sentence tells us in verse 24 is that God is greater than death. Death wasn't so invincible then, and as we will see, it's not so invincible now. Its hold over sinners can be overruled. That's what we live and believe, isn't it? The power of sin and death has been broken. There's loads of examples I can talk about this morning, but let's consider Abraham, Sarah, and Isaac. Not just because it links with my joke, but because this is what we're going to do. Family lines are a really important theme throughout the Old Testament. Like these genealogies, they're all over the place. And the line shows, when you get to Matthew and Luke, the line shows that Jesus came from the line of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, David, and all of those lines. It's an important thing that's written throughout the Bible. So it makes sense then, if a woman was unable to bear children, without the intervention of God, barrenness meant the end or the death of the family line. It couldn't continue if they couldn't have children. And we read about Abraham's wife Sarah, so Isaac's wife Rebecca, and Joseph's wife Rachel, all experiencing barrenness. I don't think I've noticed that before. All three of those patriarchs all experienced barrenness until God stepped in and overturned death and brought life. The fact is that God overcomes even this obstacle for his plan, for his purpose to continue. He brings life to each of these women's wombs, and every time it's a triumph of life over death. In Genesis 18, Abraham and Sarah are told that they're going to have a child when they're very old, and it seemed impossible. They were really old. Like, it wasn't a physically possible thing anymore. In Genesis 21, we read that God did the impossible. He gave them a son in his old age. Let's read these verses because they're good. Now the Lord was gracious to Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did for Sarah what he had promised. Sarah became pregnant and bore a son to Abraham in his old age at the very time God had promised him. Abraham gave the name Isaac to the son Sarah bore him. When his son Isaac was 8 days old, Abraham circumcised him as God commanded him. Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. Wow. Imagine chasing after a toddler at 100. Sarah said, God has brought me laughter, and everyone who hears about this will laugh with me. And she added, who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children, yet I have borne him a son in his old age. The power of life disrupting the power of death. God did for Sarah what he'd promised. God fulfilled his promise to Abraham and Sarah. It's really good, isn't it? The birth of Isaac to Abraham and Sarah, as well as the accounts of other couples who conceive children following barrenness, is just a clear sign of God overcoming death and bringing life. Let's stick with Abraham just for a bit longer. Even though God tells Abraham in Genesis 21 that his offspring would come through Isaac, in the next chapter, we've got this remarkable account of God telling Abraham to sacrifice his son Isaac. So he's been told that the promise that everything is going to come through Isaac. And then in the next chapter, he says, now I want you to sacrifice your son. Let's read it. Sometime later, God tested Abraham. He said to him, Abraham, here I am, he replied. Then God said, take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain I will show you. Early the next morning, Abraham got up and loaded his donkey. He took with him 2 of his servants and his son Isaac. When he cut enough wood for the burnt offering, he set out for the place God had told him about. On the 3rd day, notice, on the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance. He said to his servant, stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there. We will worship and then we will come back to you. Notice, Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and placed it on his son Isaac, and he himself carried the fire and the knife. As the 2 of them went on together, Isaac spoke up and said to his father Abraham, Father. Yes, my son, Abraham replied. The fire and the wood are here, Isaac said, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering? Abraham answered, God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. And the 2 of them went on together. When they reached the place God had told him about, Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood on it. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then he reached out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven, Abraham, Abraham. Here I am, he replied. Do not lay a hand on the boy, he said. Do not do anything to him. But now I know that you fear God because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son. Abraham looked up, and there in the thicket he saw a ram caught by its horns. He went over and took the ram and sacrificed it as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called that place, the Lord will provide. And to this day it's said, on the mountain of the Lord it will be provided. If you look at the words Abraham used, and I tried to kind of highlight them a little bit as we went through, he shows a remarkable level of resurrection faith. Like remarkable. Like he doesn't say, I'm believing God's going to come in here. I think God might just come and get us. I'm sure he's got a plan. I know, it was like God will provide. We will come back. That real confident, even if it was just a declaration of faith, which is what we have to do sometimes, even when we're trying to bring ourselves along with what we're standing on and what we're believing in. He still declared clearly with that resurrection faith for what God was going to do. He didn't know how he was going to do it. Abraham's faith is so clear. He even binds him and gets him on the altar. Like he doesn't just take him up the mountain and then God says, don't worry about it, you don't have to do it. He went right there to the moment and called out. That's important to be listening to God, isn't it, at all times? I think if he wasn't listening, that might actually change the story. But there was that right to the end faith that whatever's going to happen here, God, you've given me a promise. I'm going to follow you. I'm going to be obedient, whether I understand it or not, and I'm waiting to see what you're going to do. Hebrews 11 gives us this insight. Abraham reasoned that God could even raise the dead, and so in a manner of speaking, he did receive Isaac back from death. If God was going to allow Isaac to be killed on the mountain, Abraham had faith to believe that he was going to bring him back from the dead, didn't he? I think that's probably what he was probably going to go for. Because he thinks if God's told him to go and do this, clearly, he's gone to do it. He's gone right to there. He must have had faith that God was going to bring him, even though no one had been raised from the dead yet at that point in the Bible. It doesn't happen for a bit yet, physical death. But he must have had faith that he was going to bring him back if he made him go through with what he'd commanded him to do, because he knew that God's promises were true and that he was going to get all the promises were going to come through Isaac. Probably because Isaac's conception and birth was evidence of God keeping his promise and demonstrating his power, it probably helped him to think, oh, well, God, if you've gone out your way that far to bring a child to us in old age and given us all these promises attached to him, I've really got faith that this is what you're going to do. I don't know how you're going to do it, but I'm going to hold on to that. God could bring life, not just to a dead womb, but to a dead boy. I think that's what he was thinking. Abraham knew God had promised that his family line would continue. And so going up that mountain, we can't get our heads around what that would feel like at all. But I think it's faith in action, isn't it? And that's why he gets in the great hall of faith in Hebrews 11, because that's what he did. Even though Isaac didn't physically die, he was delivered from death when God told Abraham to stop, and he provided a ram instead. Does that remind you of anything? There's so many echoes of this account with the account of Jesus, aren't there? You can go through this passage and see a number of things. God provides the lamb. God provided his own son Jesus for us, for the salvation of our souls. Jesus, the Lamb of God. Did you notice that in verse 4, Abraham, it says Isaac is saved on the third day? That's interesting, isn't it? Just the first instance where we see things happen on the third day. But keep that in mind as we go through this series. We've got a few third days popping up. In other records from the first 5 books of the Old Testament, Joseph's life has got loads of elements that we could talk about. Decline, imprisonment, being sold to slavery, being left in the bottom of a well and then getting sold, and all these different things, patterns of decline, patterns of death, things that weren't going very well for him. But then also ascension to reinstatement to life again. Moses' life was delivered from imminent death when he got put in a basket in the water. His mum didn't know what was going to happen, just kind of did the best she could do in the circumstances. And the Pharaoh's daughter picks him out and his life is rescued. The Israelites were miraculously rescued from slavery and from death. In Egypt, from disease and death in the wilderness. There's a story of where the snakes were biting and killing them, and they looked up and they lived. There's this kind of death and life thing going on. And they were even brought into the inheritance of the promised land. That's the life, isn't it? That's the restoration, that's the resurrection of God. So I told you we could spend months on this topic. There's loads of it. It's all the way through. Resurrection language is also found in Deuteronomy 18:15, when Moses tells the people that the Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from among you, from your brothers. Does the use of the words raise up sound like a bit of a stretch to identify them as resurrection language? Well, if you look at Acts 3:22, Peter quotes Moses' words from this scripture, and he does it announcing God's fulfillment of that promise, not just having been fulfilled in Joshua at the time, which is what they took it and understood it as back in Deuteronomy, but being ultimately fulfilled in Jesus, because God raised Jesus from the dead, a prophet. Although in the first 5 books of the Bible, the law, there hasn't yet been an actual physical resurrection from the dead yet. There's plenty of times where God's power has overturned the powers of death and brought resurrection, life, and restoration. Interestingly, though, Paul's words when he stood before Felix during his trial 1,500 years later, he himself considered the law and the prophets to found his belief in the resurrection of all people. He talks about the law and the prophets when he's talking about the resurrection. Let's read that. But I confess to you that according to the way which they call a sect, I worship the God of our fathers, believing everything laid down by the law and written in the prophets, having a hope in God, which these men themselves accept, that there will be a resurrection of both the just and the unjust. That's a good connection, isn't it? Paul doesn't say which parts of the law and the prophetic writings led him to believe in a future resurrection, but clearly they've helped form his understanding of God's power over the forces of death. As we keep looking at passages all over the Bible through this series over the coming weeks, I don't know if you can tell, I'm a little bit excited about this. This is great stuff. If you can really grab a hold of this, you're going to be absolutely flying, I reckon. Let's see. But as we do it, as we see these instances of life over death, 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 this is what God's been doing from the beginning. This is what God is still doing today. This is what God is doing forevermore. He's going to overcome. He's already overcome the power of sin and death. We're still living in that middle bit where it's still causing us a little bit of chaos. Is that an understatement? But in the end, love wins. Life wins. Death is defeated forevermore. And that's where we're going. It's what God does, and he's always done since the beginning. Just in the first 5 books of the Bible, we see God bring order out of chaos right at the beginning, don't we? Life out of nothing. Darkness and creation from nothing. We see how God's power brought freedom from slavery, life from barren wombs, a reversal of the potential end to family lines. He brought release for prisoners, think of Joseph and others. Healing from diseases, rescue from disaster and harm, and so much more. I think if you know your Bible, you'd be thinking of, oh, what about that? What about that? Oh, that's when he did that. There's loads of it where God is just replacing the natural new order which came through the fall of death, disrupting, and God's going, no, I'm going to disrupt the death. I'm going to change it. I'm going to restore it. I'm going to bring life instead. And if you take nothing else away from this morning, know that the forces of death are no match for the God of life. The forces of death are no match for the God of life. Even if right now you've got a situation you feel like there's death around you, it might not be physical death, but some kind of hopelessness, some kind of struggle, some kind of difficulty, in the end, life wins. In the end, love conquers all. The forces of death are no match for the God of life. Wherever you see death around you or the absence of life, God has the power to overcome. Greater is he that is in us than he that's in the world. When you read the first 5 books of the Bible, allow hope to stir in you, because God is the God of life and he will triumph completely over death forever. Because of Jesus, the last Adam, we've got the first Adam in Genesis. Jesus is the last Adam, the Bible talks about him, because he does what the first Adam couldn't do. He is the priest forever. He never dies again. He's raised from life and he's alive forevermore. Because of Jesus, the last Adam, we're going to eat from the tree of life and experience life forevermore. Anyone excited by that? The books of the law show us over and over how God is faithful to his people and how God has power to keep his promises over and over. We can trust him, and we can trust that in the end, death has died and love has won. Yes. Continues next week. Amen.